In this video we will explore what a soldier would have eaten during the First World War, not just the Allied forces but also from the side of the Germans. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like and or subscribe. As for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Prologue: The weight of a haversack. Before the war, people had eaten simply and not thought much about it. A farmer's wife in Bavaria set bread and cold pork on the table before dawn. A docker's family in Liverpool spooned up porridge in a kitchen that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. Food was fuel, food was habit, food was home. Nobody wrote poems about it. Then the war came, and suddenly food became something else entirely. It became survival. It became comfort in conditions that offered almost none. It became a measure of how much your army, your government, your officers, your country actually cared whether you lived or died. By Christmas of 1914, the Western Front had settled into its terrible stillness. The lines had hardened. The movement was over. What replaced it was something new in the history of warfare, an industrial siege that would last 4 years, and that would require feeding millions of men in holes in the ground, day after day, in all weathers, under shellfire, across supply lines that stretched back hundreds of miles to the factories and farms of 2 exhausted continents. The logistics of feeding a modern army were staggering. The British Expeditionary Force alone, by 1916, required roughly 500 tons of food every single day just to keep its men functional. The Germans faced the same arithmetic on their side of the wire. Bread, meat, fat, sugar, salt, every calorie had to be grown somewhere, processed somewhere, packed into tins or sacks or waxed paper, loaded onto trains, driven up in wagons through shell-cratered roads, and finally carried by hand, often in the dark, often under fire, to the men waiting in the mud below. And yet, despite everything, they were fed. Imperfectly, inconsistently, sometimes barely, but fed. Chapter 1: The British Tommies. Ration. Let us begin on the British side of the line. A British soldier in 1914 was entitled, on paper, to what was called the Field Service Ration. It was a generous allowance, at least in theory, 1 1/4 pounds of fresh meat per day, or 1 pound of preserved meat. 1 pound of bread, or 3/4 pound of biscuit. Bacon. Tea. Sugar. Jam. Salt. And a small daily measure of cheese. In practice, what arrived at the front was rarely what the regulations promised. Fresh meat was a luxury of the rear areas. By the time rations reached the forward trenches, often carried by working parties trudging through communication trenches for hours in the darkness, what a Tommy received was rather more modest. The cornerstone of British trench food was the tin. Bully beef, corned beef, pressed and salted, was the great staple of the British infantryman. The tins were rectangular, slightly tapered, sealed with a small key that soldiers wound around a metal strip to peel back the lid. Inside was a dense, dark, fibrous meat, glossy with fat, smelling sharply of salt and something faintly metallic. It was not, by any honest account, delicious. Men ate it cold, straight from the tin, with their fingers or a clasp knife. They ate it heated over a small fire when fires were possible. They mixed it with whatever else was to hand: broken biscuit, a scraping of jam, half a raw onion cadged from a farmyard. They complained about it constantly, and they depended on it absolutely. Alongside the bully beef came the hardtack biscuit. These were not biscuits in any sense that would comfort a man who had grown up with his mother's baking. They were thick, pale, almost perfectly square slabs of unleavened flour and water, baked until they were hard enough to have been used, some men swore, as building material. Biting into one risked a tooth. Soaking one in tea for several minutes produced something closer to edible, a thick, pale paste that at least softened the jaw's labor. Many soldiers ground them against the inside of a tin cup, reducing them to a coarse flour that could be stirred into a soup or a stew. Tea, however, was non-negotiable. If there is one substance that sustained the British soldier's spirit through 4 years of industrialized misery, it was tea. Strong, hot, heavily sweetened with condensed milk and rough sugar, the kind of tea that left a dark ring inside a tin mug and warmed a man from the inside out in a way that seemed almost medicinal. Men went to extraordinary lengths to brew tea in the trenches. Small fires were lit in tins punctured with bayonet holes to reduce the visible glow. Alcohol-burning cookers, called Tommy cookers, were issued and treasured. Anything that could hold water and be heated over a flame was pressed into service. A hot mug of tea before stand to at dawn was not a luxury. It was, for many men, the psychological hinge on which the day turned. Chapter 2, Behind the German Wire. Cross now to the other side. The German soldier, the Lanzer, as he was sometimes called, ate from a system that was, in its early years, equally comprehensive and, in some respects, more sophisticated than the British equivalent. Germany entered the war with a well-organized military commissariat and a tradition of careful logistical planning. The German field ration was calculated with scientific attention to caloric content, protein, and fat, in a way that reflected the emerging science of nutrition that German universities had helped to pioneer. The core of the German daily ration in the early war years included bread, substantial quantities of it, along with meat, dried vegetables, and fat. The bread deserves particular attention, because for the German soldier, as for the German civilian, bread was not merely food. It was something closer to identity. German military bread in 1914 was typically a dark, dense rye loaf called Kommissbrot, literally, commissary bread. It was heavy and slightly sour, with a close crumb and a thick, hard crust. It kept reasonably well in cool conditions, which made it well suited to field use. A soldier might receive his bread ration as a whole small loaf, or as cut slices packed into his canvas bread bag, the Brotbeutel, which he wore slung from his belt alongside his other equipment. With the bread came fat, specifically, a generous ration of butter or schmaltz, the rendered pork fat that was a staple of German working-class cooking. Spread thickly onto a slice of dark rye, perhaps with a scraping of tin sausage or a smear of Leberwurst, it was a meal that would have been recognizable on any German kitchen table. There was comfort in that recognition, and soldiers knew it and were grateful for it. German tinned rations included Erbswurst pea sausage, a remarkable invention that came in the form of a compressed, shrink-wrapped cylinder of dried pea flour, fat, and spices. To prepare it, a soldier broke off a section, crumbled it into a mess tin of boiling water, and stirred. What resulted was a thick, savory pea soup that was hot, filling, calorie-dense, and genuinely not unpleasant. It was easy to carry, easy to prepare, and popular enough that it outlasted the war in German memory. Men wrote home about it. Mothers asked to replicate it. It was, in its small way, a success. Coffee, or rather, Kaffeeersatz, coffee substitute, was the German soldier's equivalent of the Tommy's tea. Real coffee had been a luxury before the war. By 1915 it was essentially unobtainable in quantity. What replaced it was a dark brew made from roasted barley, chicory, or acorns, sweetened with beet sugar and drunk from a Feldbecher, the standard issue field cup. It was not coffee. Nobody pretended it was coffee. But it was hot, and dark, and slightly bitter, and it was drunk at dawn in the cold, and it served something of the same function that tea served across the wire. It was the ritual that began the day and made the day seem manageable. Chapter 3, The Kitchen on Wheels. Neither army left its men to fend entirely for themselves. Both sides deployed mobile field kitchens, the Gulaschkanone on the German side, so called because it resembled a field gun from a distance, and the British equivalent that soldiers nicknamed the cooker, which moved as close to the front as was judged survivable, and sent hot food forward in insulated containers. The German Gulaschkanone was a wood-burning stove mounted on a wheeled chassis, capable of cooking for 150 men at a time. It could produce soup, stew, porridge, or rice, and on good days when rations were adequate and the cooks had something to work with, it produced meals that men actually looked forward to. German regimental cooks sometimes showed genuine creativity, stretching limited ingredients with dried mushrooms foraged from nearby woods, or flavoring a thin barley soup with a handful of caraway seeds. On the British side, the regimental cooker worked similarly. A cook might produce a stew of bully beef, hard biscuit broken and used as thickening, potatoes when available, onions, perhaps a scraping of Bovril for depth. The resulting liquid was ladled into a dixie, a large oval cooking pot, and the dixie was carried forward through the trench system, sometimes for a considerable distance, arriving warm rather than hot, but welcome all the same. The meal would be spooned into each man's mess tin, and eaten with a clasp knife and a spoon, usually sitting with the back against the forward wall of the trench, feet in the mud, eyes on the sky. A pause at the fireside. It is worth stopping here, for a moment, and imagining what this actually looked and felt like. Picture the trench at dusk in October. The sky above the parapet is turning from grey to a deeper, darker grey. The guns have been quiet for an hour, not silent. They are never entirely silent, but quieter than before, a distant muttering rather than a roar. The smell is one that defies easy description, earth and rot and something chemical, Wet wool, cigarette smoke, the faint sweetness of whatever is in the approaching Dixie. A man holds out his mess tin. The ladle goes in. He finds a spot, perhaps a fire step, perhaps a dugout entrance, and he eats. He eats with attention, because in conditions like these, a hot meal commands attention. He eats quickly, because the meal is only as hot as it will ever be. He scrapes the tin clean with his finger. He passes his mug forward for tea. For perhaps 10 minutes, the war retreats a few yards. And on the other side of the wire, a man in field grey does much the same thing. His bread bag sits beside him. His Feldbecher is warm in his hands. His pea soup made from that pressed cylinder of Erbswurst steams faintly in the cooling air. They are enemies. They are exhausted. They are eating supper. By the winter of 1916, the war had been going for 2.5 years. Almost nobody had expected that. The men who had marched away in August of 1914 had been told, and many had believed, that it would be over by Christmas. The first Christmas. There had been 3 Christmases now, each one spent in the same mud, the same cold, the same trenches that had by now become so permanent they appeared on printed maps. The war had stopped being an event and become a condition. A state of the world, like weather. And like weather, it bore down on everything. Including what men ate. Chapter 4, When the System Strains. The British ration system had been designed for a war of movement. An army that marched and fought and advanced could be supplied along roads and railways that followed its progress. But a static army, millions of men fixed in position along hundreds of miles of trench, was a different problem entirely, and by 1916 the supply system was showing its seams. Fresh meat became increasingly rare at the front. The refrigerated railway wagons that might have carried it were needed elsewhere, or were simply insufficient in number. What arrived instead was more bully beef, more hardtack, more of the preserved and tinned and salted food that men had already been eating for 2 years and had grown to associate with a kind of grey, grinding endurance. Bread at the front was often stale by the time it arrived baked days earlier at field bakeries miles to the rear, wrapped in cloth or paper, carried forward by the same working parties that brought ammunition and water. In summer, in the heat of a French August, it sometimes arrived already beginning to mold. Men ate it anyway. Jam was a point of particular grievance. The British Army issued jam in vast quantities. It was calorie-dense, it kept well, it required no preparation, and it could be eaten on a biscuit or stirred into porridge or consumed directly from the tin with a finger. All of this was true, and none of it made the jam popular. The variety issued was almost exclusively plum and apple, a combination so ubiquitous, so inescapable, so relentlessly repeated that soldiers developed a loathing for it that bordered on the philosophical. Men who had never thought much about jam before the war emerged from it with a settled, articulate contempt for the plum and apple variety that lasted the rest of their lives. They had eaten it every day for months. They had eaten it cold, they had eaten it warm, they had eaten it off biscuits that tasted of tin, they had eaten it because there was nothing else. It was sustenance. It was not pleasure. What men wanted, what they dreamed about, what they wrote home requesting in letters that were censored and delayed and sometimes never arrived, was ordinary food. Not luxury. Just ordinary. A chop. A boiled potato. Bread that was fresh. Butter. A fried egg. The food of before, the food of kitchens that smelled of real things, of tables set with actual plates. Chapter 5, Parcels from Home. Into this gap stepped the parcel. Families sent food from home throughout the war, a practice that the military authorities permitted and quietly depended upon to supplement the official ration. The parcels arrived at battalion post offices and were distributed with the mail, and their arrival was an event in the life of a platoon. A man might receive a tin of Huntley and Palmer's biscuits, proper sweet ones, quite unlike the hardtack. A slab of fruit cake, dense and dark, baked by a mother or a wife with dried fruit saved over weeks. A pot of potted meat. A block of chocolate. Cigarettes, which were currency as much as comfort. A small bottle of Bovril, or a tin of Oxo cubes that could be dissolved in hot water to make something that, in the dark and the cold of a dugout, could pass for broth. These parcels were usually shared. Not always, not entirely, but the social calculus of the trench, the enforced proximity, the interdependence, the knowledge that the man beside you might be all that stood between you and catastrophe produced a kind of informal communism around food. A man who received a cake and ate it alone would be noticed. The usual practice was to open the parcel in the dugout, announce its contents with appropriate ceremony, and distribute portions with a generosity that was genuine even when it cost something. The Germans had their equivalent. The Feldpostpaket, the field post parcel, arrived from German homes bearing dark bread, smoked sausage, tins of sardines, hard cheeses, dried fruit, and Pfefferkuchen, the spiced gingerbread that was a staple of German festive baking. A soldier from Nuremberg might receive a package of Lebkuchen from his mother, the same dense, spiced biscuits that were sold at the Christmas markets he had attended as a child. He would sit in his dugout and eat one slowly, and for a moment the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be would collapse to almost nothing. Food from home was not merely nourishment. It was a message. It said, "We know where you are. We are thinking of you. We are still here. Come back." Chapter 6: The Blockade and the Turnip Winter. On the German side of the wire, however, the parcels were becoming harder to fill. From the very beginning of the war, the British Royal Navy had imposed a naval blockade on Germany, a sustained, methodical effort to cut off the flow of imported food and raw materials into the German economy. It was a weapon wielded slowly, across years, and its effects crept up on the German home front and, in turn, on the German army, with a terrible patience. Germany before the war had imported roughly a third of its food supply: grain from Russia, fats and oils from overseas, animal feed that supported a livestock population that fed its people. The blockade severed these supply lines. By 1915 the effects were beginning to be felt. By 1916 they were severe. The winter of 1916 to 1917 entered German memory and German history as the Stechrubenwinter, the turnip winter. The harvest of 1916 had been poor. The potato crop, a cornerstone of German diet, had failed catastrophically. What remained in adequate supply was the turnip, specifically the Mangelwurzel, a large, coarse root vegetable that had previously been used almost exclusively as cattle fodder. Now it fed people. German civilians ate turnip bread, turnip soup, turnip jam, turnip coffee. They ate turnips boiled, fried, dried, and pickled. The turnip was everywhere. It was filling in the way that only something very fibrous and very bland can be, filling. It occupied space in the stomach without providing much of what the body actually needed. Caloric intake on the German home front that winter fell to levels that produced genuine hunger, genuine malnutrition, genuine suffering. And the effects reached the trenches. The German soldiers' ration, which had been substantial in 1914, contracted visibly as the war went on. Meat rations were cut. Fat rations were cut. The bread ration, that psychologically important loaf of dark rye, was adulterated first with potato flour, then with turnip flour, then with other substitutes that made it heavier, darker, more bitter, and less nourishing. By 1917 the Kriegsbrot war bread bore little resemblance to the Kommissbrot that men had eaten in the early months. Soldiers wrote home asking their families not to send food, because they knew their families had so little. Families sent it anyway, because they could not bear not to. Chapter 7: Ingenuity Below Ground. Faced with official rations that were insufficient and uncertain, men on both sides of the line did what hungry people throughout history have always done. They improvised. Foraging was universal. Behind the British lines, soldiers raided farmhouse gardens with cheerful opportunism, digging up potatoes, pulling onions, collecting eggs from the henhouses of evacuated farms. Officers sometimes looked away. The French farmers who returned to their land after the front had moved sometimes found their kitchen gardens stripped to the earth and their orchards comprehensively harvested. They were not always philosophical about this. The Germans foraged with similar industry. Men gathered mushrooms from the woods behind the line when wood duty or working parties took them there. Wild garlic and sorrel were collected and added to whatever was being cooked. Rabbits were snared, occasionally. A fortunate unit might be billeted near a pond, and fishing with hand lines, or less legitimately with a grenade, was not unknown. On both sides, men became remarkably skilled at cooking with almost nothing. A British soldier named Robert Coode, whose diary survives, described making a stew from bully beef, broken biscuit, a handful of oatmeal, some wild onions, and water, cooked in a cut-down fuel tin over a small fire of splintered duckboard. He called it, with some irony, a ragout. He said it was the best meal he had eaten in 3 weeks, and he meant it. The Germans had their own versions. A soldier might carry a small bag of dried lentils or barley in his kit, not issued, but brought from home and guarded carefully. Added to a thin official soup, they transformed it. Eintopf, the great German one-pot meal, translated perfectly to trench cooking. Everything into one vessel, everything simmered together until the flavors blurred into something unified and warming. There was, in all of this improvisation, something that went beyond mere hunger. Cooking, even crude cooking, even cooking under shellfire with inadequate ingredients over a fire that had to be kept small enough to avoid drawing attention, was an act of agency. It was something a man could control, in a situation where almost nothing was under his control. Choosing what to add, deciding how long to cook it, sharing the result with the men around him, these small acts maintained something essential about being human. Chapter 8: Rum and Schnapps. No account of what soldiers ate and drank in the First World War could neglect what they drank that was not tea or ersatz coffee. The British Army issued rum. A daily tot, officially 1/16 of a pint of Navy-strength rum, was distributed from a large ceramic jar, marked with the letters SRD, which officially stood for Supply Reserve Depot, and which soldiers, with the irreverence that sustained them, rendered as seldom reaches destination. The rum came up in the same ration parties as the food, carried in its heavy jar, and was dispensed by the company sergeant major into each man's mess tin, a small, dark, fierce measure that burned going down and spread warmth outward from the chest. It was given before raids. It was given in the cold before dawn stand-to. It was given after something very bad had happened. It was not given every day, despite the regulation supply was erratic, and officers sometimes withheld it on moral grounds, though such officers were rarely popular. When it arrived, it was received with something close to reverence. The Germans had schnapps, grain spirits, usually, or sometimes a rougher potato spirit distributed through similar channels and serving similar purposes. And they had beer, which occupied a place in German military culture that had no real British equivalent. German field canteens behind the line often served beer, and a man rotating out of the trenches for a few days' rest could sit in an estaminet or a canteen and drink a liter of dark lager and feel, for a while, that he was somewhere else entirely. Both armies also had wine, in France. British soldiers discovered it with curiosity and then enthusiasm. The cheap red wine available in villages behind the line vin ordinaire, served in cafés and estaminets by French women of all ages, was unlike anything most working-class British soldiers had encountered at home. They drank it mixed with water, or simply drank it until they understood it better. Some men acquired a taste for it that they carried home after the war. A moment between two trenches. It is December 1916. The Somme offensive, which began in July with the greatest single-day losses in the history of the British Army, has finally guttered to a close in the November mud. The line has moved a few miles. Nothing decisive has changed. On the British side, a working party has brought up the rations. There is bully beef, the eternal bully beef. There is tea, strong and sweet. There is, with a particular stroke of good fortune, a small amount of fresh bread, real bread, still slightly warm, sent up from a field bakery that has for once managed to get ahead of itself. The sergeant distributes it carefully, each man's portion measured against his eye with the care of a jeweler. The men eat it slowly, without speaking. On the German side, a cook has managed to produce a pot of barley soup from a ration that includes, on paper, meat but in practice mostly bone. He has added dried mushrooms, collected during the autumn, and a handful of caraway seeds from his own pocket. The soup is thin. It is hot. It fills the mess tin and warms the hands wrapped around it. Both men, if we could see them at this moment, at this same hour, are doing the same thing. They are eating. They are alive. They are finding, in the small daily ritual of food, something that the war has tried very hard to take from them and has not, quite, managed to. Not yet. By the spring of 1918, the war had been going for nearly 4 years. A generation of men had grown up inside it. Boys who had enlisted at 17 or 18 in that distant, almost mythological summer of 1914 were now in their early 20s, and they had spent the whole of their adult lives in uniform, in mud, in the particular rhythm of the trenches, the stand-to at dawn, the working parties at night, the ration parties, the rum jar, the bully beef, the tea. For some of them, it was the only adult life they had ever known. And then, in the autumn of 1918, it ended. Chapter 9: The Final Push. The last year of the war brought change to both sides, and the change arrived partly through food. On the German side, the situation had become critical. The naval blockade, grinding on through its 4th year, had reduced the German home front to a condition of genuine hardship that was now feeding back into the military. German soldiers rotating out of the line into rest areas found little comfort there. The food in the rear was not substantially better than the food at the front. Morale, which had been sustained through years of difficulty by the essential human capacity for adaptation and endurance, was beginning to fracture. German officers reported with increasing alarm through 1918 that their men were stopping during advances to loot Allied supply dumps. This was not mere opportunism. When German soldiers broke into captured British positions and found the ration stores, what they discovered was a revelation. The quantity and quality of food on the British side, the tins of meat, the biscuits, the jam, the tea, the cigarettes, told them something they had perhaps suspected but not wanted to know. The gap between what Germany could feed its army and what Britain could feed hers had opened into something that looked, and felt, like the shape of the outcome. Men who had fought through the turnip winter, who had watched their bread ration adulterated into something barely recognizable, who had received letters from home describing conditions that they felt powerless to alleviate, these men looked at the captured British stores and understood, in the most direct and physical way possible, that their country was losing. Food had become a fact of the war's ending. Chapter 10, The Armistice Table. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. The guns stopped. There is a particular quality to silence that has replaced a very loud noise. People who were there on that morning on both sides, in villages and fields and trenches across hundreds of miles of France and Belgium, described it with a consistent bewilderment. They did not immediately know what to do with the silence. They stood in it. They sat down in it. Some of them wept. Some of them, by their own accounts, felt almost nothing, a numbness that was not the absence of feeling but a kind of overload, a circuit breaker tripping. And then, gradually, inevitably, they ate. On the British side, the cooks did what cooks do in moments of extremity: they cooked. In many units, a special meal was prepared for the evening of the 11th of November. It was not always elaborate, the rations were what they were, but effort was made. Extra food was found, or requisitioned, or in some cases simply taken from stores with an informality that the circumstances seemed to justify. Men ate together in larger groups than usual, outside rather than in dugouts, in the thin autumn light, with something that might have been celebration and might equally have been disbelief. In German lines, the response was quieter. The armistice meant, for German soldiers, not victory but a homeward march hundreds of miles, through a country that was itself exhausted and fractured, toward a home front that had already begun a revolution. German soldiers walking westward and then eastward, out of France and Belgium and back across the Rhine, were fed as best the collapsing supply system could manage. Some units maintained order and discipline. Others dissolved on the road, men drifting away toward their own villages, eating what they could find, welcomed with complicated emotions by the civilians they passed. The first meal home, for men on both sides, became one of the most written about moments of the entire war. Soldiers who kept diaries, who wrote letters, who later gave interviews or composed memoirs, almost all of them mentioned it. The moment of sitting at a table, a real table, with a tablecloth perhaps, with crockery, with food cooked on a proper stove by someone who knew them, who had cooked for them before, who had been cooking all this time, waiting. Chapter 11, What They Remembered. Memory is peculiar about food. A smell, a taste, a specific texture, these can carry a person across decades and deposit them without warning in a moment they thought they had left behind. This is true of pleasant memories and unpleasant ones equally. The soldiers of the First World War discovered this in the years and decades after the armistice, and many of them wrote about it. Some foods they could not eat again. The smell of bully beef, for some men, was enough to bring back the whole architecture of the trenches, the smell of the earth, the weight of the kit, the particular darkness before dawn stand to. Men who had eaten hardtack biscuits for months, who had ground them against tin cups and soaked them in tea and depended on them for their daily calories, found in peacetime that they could not look at a plain biscuit without something tightening in the chest. The plum and apple jam, which had been ubiquitous and unloved, became for many men a taste they actively avoided for the rest of their lives. To eat it was to be there again, in the most immediate sensory sense, back in the cold, back in the mud, back in a time they were trying very hard to move beyond. German veterans had their own catalogue of tastes they could not revisit. The thick, slightly sour flavor of adulterated war bread. The particular blandness of turnip, which had ceased to be merely a vegetable and had become a symbol of a winter that had seemed like it might never end. The slightly metallic aftertaste of ersatz coffee, drunk from a field cup in conditions that no amount of peacetime comfort could fully erase. But there were other tastes, and this is the more complicated and perhaps more interesting part that they spent years trying to recapture. The tea. For many British veterans, a cup of tea made exactly right, strong, very sweet, with condensed milk if possible, drunk very hot, could produce something close to peace. Not because it was extraordinary tea, but because it had been so reliably there, so consistently the thing that preceded everything else, the first warm thing of the cold morning, the signal that another day had begun and that they were still in it. German veterans spoke of Erbswurst with a nostalgia that surprised their families. The pressed pea sausage, which had been field rations and nothing more, which had been eaten because there was nothing else, which had been stirred into hot water in a mess tin in a hole in the ground, it became, in memory, something associated with the companionship of the men they had eaten it beside. You cannot separate the taste of a thing from the circumstances of its eating. The pea soup tasted like the men around the fire. It tasted like still being alive. And so, improbably, it tasted good. Some veterans sought out the estaminets and cafes of French and Belgian villages, returning after the war as tourists or on pilgrimages to battlefields, and sat again in the same rooms where they had drunk thin red wine and eaten egg and chips from the menu that every British soldier behind the lines had memorized. Œufs pommes de terre frites. Eggs and fried potatoes. It had been, in the years of the war, the great luxury of the rest area, the meal that meant you were not at the front, that you were sleeping in a barn on real straw rather than on the fire step, that someone was cooking for you who was not a regimental cook working from a field kitchen. They ate it again, decades later, in the same rooms, and found it tasted exactly as they remembered, and wept, sometimes, for reasons they could not entirely explain even to themselves. Chapter 12. What food was. We have followed two soldiers through 4 years of a war, and we have watched what they ate. We have seen the careful arithmetic of the ration, the pound of meat, the loaf of bread, the measure of fat, and we have seen how that arithmetic stretched and contracted under the pressures of logistics and blockade and the simple, brutal mathematics of a war that cost more than anyone had calculated. We have seen improvisation and ingenuity. We have seen the field kitchen steaming in a shattered landscape, and the parcel from home opened in a dugout, and the mess tin held out for tea in the grey light before dawn. And in all of this, something persistent emerges. Something that the war, despite everything it destroyed, did not manage to destroy. Food, in the trenches of the First World War, was stubbornly and irreducibly human. The need for it, the pleasure of it when pleasure was possible, the creativity applied to it in impossible circumstances, the sharing of it, these things maintained something in men that the conditions around them were constantly working to extinguish. The act of eating together, which is one of the oldest social acts our species performs, continued in the mud and the cold, in the dark dugouts and the shattered villages, across 4 years of industrialized violence. Men on both sides of the wire sat down with their mess tins and their bread bags and their tea and their pea soup, and they were, in those moments, not soldiers. Or not only soldiers. They were people who were hungry and who ate, and who found in the eating something that the war could not take away entirely. The British Tommy called it his grub, and complained about it constantly, and would not have traded it for anything. The German Lanzer called it his rations, and stretched them and supplemented them and was grateful for them, and wrote home to thank his mother for the gingerbread. They were enemies. History has recorded them that way, and history is not wrong. But they were also, each of them, a man sitting somewhere cold with something warm in his hands, trying to get through the day. And the next one. And the one after that. Epilogue, a recipe for pea soup. There is a recipe for Erbswurst that was published in Germany after the war, for civilians who had come to know the field ration during the long years of shortage and wanted to make it at home. It calls for dried peas, ground fine, salt pork fat, rendered, onion powder, a little pepper, perhaps a pinch of marjoram. You mix it together. You press it into a cylinder. You break off a piece and crumble it into boiling water and stir. What you get is a thick, savory soup that smells of the earth and tastes of simplicity. It is not sophisticated. It does not need to be. People made it in their kitchens in Hamburg and Munich and Cologne, in the 1920s, in the years when the war was trying to become the past. Some of them had been soldiers. Some of them had been the wives and mothers and sisters of soldiers. Some of them were too young to remember, but they were not too young to have grown up in the shadow of what the war had been. They stirred the soup. They tasted it. They sat down at their tables. They ate. This has been what they ate: food on the Western Front. A story in 3 parts. The soldiers of the First World War: British, German, French, Australian, Canadian, Indian, American, and all the others who were fed or went hungry across the long years of that conflict are gone now. But the records they left behind, the letters and diaries and memoirs, are full of food. Full of hunger and comfort and the extraordinary importance of ordinary things. We remember them. This concludes the video. Thanks for watching.